Hello and welcome to the special ADM Investor Services webcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed here today are solely those of our guests and should not be construed as the views or opinions of ADM Investor Services or Archer Daniels Midland. Our featured guests are Steve Freed, Vice President of Grain Research at ADM Investor Services, and Drew Lerner, President and Senior Meteorologist at World Weather Inc. Please welcome Steve and Drew.
Thanks, Jeannie. I think we all know that one of the big factors in grain price discovery is weather. We're very fortunate today to have Drew Lerner go through some slides and give us an outlook for the 2022 weather conditions. I think we already know that in 2021, South American weather has had an impact on prices, and now we look forward to 2022. So I'm just going to hand it over to Drew. Drew, go ahead and enlighten us about the 2022 weather outlook.
All right, very good. Thank you, Steve. And good afternoon to you all. The forecast this spring and summer is certainly going to be of great interest. Obviously, we've had a tough year in South America, and the U.S. is in a very unique position right now to experience some adverse weather. We're going to talk about a melding of several weather patterns that are coming together, and they all seem to have the same bottom line signal, and that is for dryness to evolve across portions of the central U.S. and maybe including not only the plains, but the western corn belt. And we're going to take a look at that. Let's jump right into that. And what you're looking at right now is the 60-day percent of normal precipitation. And all I really want you to do on the top and bottom charts here, the bottom one goes back to October 1st. It's basically the water year. And I just want you to look at all the areas that have been below normal on precipitation since October. And you will notice that it includes most of hard red winter wheat country, a big part of the southwestern states, the far west in general for the most part, and now even a part of the southeastern U.S. is beginning to turn drier as well. Also, please note the above average precipitation that's present in the lower and eastern parts of the Midwest. All of this is La Niña. The signature of La Niña is quite obvious right now across the U.S. And on the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see the temperature anomaly for the winter, December through February. And the bottom line is that it was a little cooler than usual across the northern states, very classic La Niña as well, and some above normal temperatures occurring across the central and southeastern parts of the country. So I want you to kind of get that feel in the back of your mind because La Niña is in control. But I want you to wait just a moment and let's talk about some of this dryness that's present because it hasn't been just a phenomenon over the past few months, let alone the last year. It's actually started in 2020. And you're looking at several charts here from the Drought Monitor. The two on the right-hand side of the screen reflect a drought that occurred in 2002 and continued right into 2004. And the two charts on the left are illustrative of our drought this past 2 years, actually beginning in 2020 and continuing until now. And I just want you to notice the significance, the parallel in the two sets of years. The drought that occurred in 2002 through 2004 was just about as widespread and persistent as the drought we have seen since 2020 in North America. And this is very important for two reasons. Number one, it's very unusual to have a weather pattern that persists over such a long period of time, copying another year. You know, we can see parallels in weather pattern that are similar for a few months, maybe as much as maybe 6 or 9 months in some cases, but they always break down. This particular pattern has been locked in and for an extended period of time. And there's a good reason for that. It has to do with being in the 22-year solar cycle, having La Niña around, and also the negative PDO. So what I want you also to notice while you're looking at these charts is how little the drought changed from the beginning of the drought period to the most recent chart. So in 2002 of December in the lower right-hand corner, drought was pretty much in the same place that it was in January of 2004. And the same thing on the left-hand side, the December of 2020 chart looks very similar to the January of 2022 chart. And if I had the latest data for February, it would show the very same thing. The drought monitor, just zooming in a little bit on the areas that have been driest here most recently. You can obviously, you've all been seeing this. I'm not going to dwell on this chart at all, but just wanted to zoom in for a moment and show the areas in the U.S. that are still definitely dry biased, whether they're in drought or abnormally dry. It's a fairly large region, and we have to be concerned about that. If you're going to break down a drought, you have to if you're breaking down a regional drought, it's a lot easier to break because you've got areas surrounding that regional drought that usually have moisture around. When you have half of a continent that is running dry, bringing a rain system into that area is going to be really difficult to keep the moisture from evaporating away. And this is one of the reasons why droughts that are this big are really hard to end. These are the factors that are going to be playing into our weather as we go forward through this next several month period. And it's a long list, and it's very important to make note of each one of these factors. We've already talked about the drought that's out there, so we'll go ahead and move into the Pacific Decadal Oscillator. We'll talk about that a little bit. We're in a very strong negative PDO right now, and that has a huge influence on North America, especially as we get into the warm season. It will help to reinforce ridge building in the middle of the country. We also have a La Nina event that's been prevailing for almost as long as the drought has. It started in 2020 as well, and it's still alive and well, and it doesn't look like it's going to go away anytime real soon. Having La Nina and negative PDO working at the same time we have the 22-year solar cycle in place is always a bad omen. If you go back and look at historical charts, you will always see a rather persistence of dryness in those situations, and I'll show that to you shortly. The last thing that I really want to mention is the 18-year cycle that's playing out right now. I use that in a lot of years. It's actually a lunar cycle, but it helps to determine what the upper wind flow pattern is going to be like. Well, I don't need to say too much about La Nina. Everybody knows it's still at present. The cooler than usual ocean temperature anomalies that are out there in the eastern Pacific are still in place. We have seen a lot of weakening in La Nina here recently, and that the big question is whether or not that's going to continue or whether we're going to hold on with this La Nina event. And there are a lot of differing opinions out there. If we look at subsurface ocean temperature anomalies, which is important to note, we can see that there's warming occurring below the surface of the ocean. And actually, the surface temperature anomalies change from the bottom of the ocean to the top. So we're seeing some definite weakening trend, but there's some reasons to believe that La Nina will actually prevail for a longer period of time, despite the weakening trend that's underway. And NOAA's forecast model seems to be on that same page. NOAA's model has has consistently been predicting that La Nina would continue as we go forward through these next several months. The heavy black line is ocean temperature anomalies relative to normal. So, and we're talking about that eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean area. So if we just make note of the fact that everything below this purple line would be colder than normal ocean temperatures. Anything above the red line would be warmer than normal ocean temperatures. We're talking about that equatorial Pacific Ocean area. So we did end up going into a La Nina back in September, maybe even late August in some people's eyes. And we've been in La Nina ever since. La Nina is basically colder than normal ocean water temperatures out there in that equatorial region of the Pacific. The forecast is in the green box. NOAA's model runs multiple model runs every time they come up with a forecast. The heavy black dashed line is the average of all those forecasts. And you notice here that we continue to be cooler than normal in the ocean, according to NOAA's model. Now, a little word of caution, NOAA's model doesn't do well in January or February. And now that we've crossed over and we're into March, in another week, we will see the model possibly adjust itself. And I'm anxious to see that. Sometimes it doesn't do real well in beyond the third month of the forecast until you get into March. So we're looking to see if there might be a little adjustment. But nevertheless, NOAA's model suggests that all the way through spring, we're going to have a La Nina event, and even suggests that it's going to stay with us through the summer. Well, how can that be if La Nina is weakening? Well, there seems to be an association with the La Nina and the 22-year solar cycle, and I'll show you the statistics behind that in just a moment. La Nina generates a northwest flow pattern during the winter season. And if you are been paying much attention to what's been going on this winter, you know that there's been a lot of cold surges coming down from Canada into the north central United States. And that's because of the orientation of the jet stream being in this northwest flow pattern. And so it has brought along a lot of cool weather. It's also brought in a northwest flow, which has been fairly dry biased for the western part of the U.S. And we have seen that cold air come into the eastern part of the country and generate some frequent precipitation events. And as we noted at the very beginning of this webinar, there's a tendency for La Nina events to produce above average precipitation across the lower eastern Midwest, the northern Delta, and the Tennessee River Basin area. We saw that on the percent of normal charts, and you can see that right here in the soil moisture assessment. And there's also a tendency for La Nina to leave a large part of the central and southwest plains drier biased, and the western part of the U.S., especially from central California southward into the desert southwest. La Nina also tends to reduce precipitation in the late winter and spring in the southeastern corner of the country. This is just now starting. And over these next few weeks, you're going to see this area in the southeast be progressively drying out. At the same time, we're expecting La Nina to continue in the U.S. plains, and that's going to continue to perpetuate the dry bias there as well. Although there will be an opportunity for some short-term breaks in the drying trend, and we'll be looking for that. This is what La Nina does typically during the late winter and spring seasons. And I want you to kind of focus a little bit on the two upper rightmost charts here for February through April and March through May. Everything that's brown or tan colored up there on the charts is below average precipitation during the late winter and spring. And the yellows and oranges that you see in the southeastern corner of the country is even more significantly anomalously dry bias conditions. So with the forecast being what it is, with La Nina still hanging on, according to NOAA's model, we're most likely going to see that dry bias in the southeast perpetuate. And at the same time, a big part of the central plains is going to see a drier tendency as well. And some of that dryness gets into the western corn belt. We've already seen that, if you recall, in the percent of normal charts we showed at the very beginning of this talk. There was already then some below average precipitation in that region. And that, too, is going to likely prevail as long as La Nina sticks around. Notice the temperature anomalies during late spring, where we should see warmer than usual temperatures in the central and southern plains and a big part of the mid-south through the southern half to two-thirds of the Atlantic coastal states, while cool weather stays up on the north border area of the U.S. All right, so with that in mind, let's take a look at the PDO. Now, Pacific Decadal Oscillation has to do with ocean temperatures out across the Pacific. In order to be in the negative phase of PDO, you need to have cooler than usual ocean water temperatures off the west coast of North America. At the same time, you need a broad area of warmer than normal ocean water that is in the north central parts of the Atlantic. So the classic case is this bottom chart here that we're looking at. The top chart is where we are right now. I've got several things indicated on this top chart. Obviously, the La Nina box in the equatorial region, but up in the Gulf of Alaska, there is some cooler than usual ocean temperatures there. And you can have to look real hard, but there's some speckling of cooler than normal water temperatures off the U.S. California coast as well. It's not very dramatic, but it's very warm across the north central Pacific. And so it does meet the classifications of a negative phase PDO. Well, why do we care about negative PDO? For the same reason we care a little bit about La Nina. It tends to put a little bit of a dryness issue in the middle of North America. The changes in the ocean temperature anomalies is in the bottom part of this chart. In the red circle, there's been some warming that's taking place in the Gulf of Alaska. And I think that's very important to watch, because if we're going to lose PDO, you want to see that Gulf of Alaska warm up. But you also want to see the water off the west coast of the U.S. as cold, steadier, and get warmer too. Instead, we're seeing a little bit of a cooling trend off the California and Washington coast. So there's some suggestion here the PDO is not going away either. So we're looking at a situation where La Nina may prevail and PDO may prevail, which is really important. Now, before I go any further, it's real important for you to know that if we lose both of those phenomena, if we lose La Nina, and if we lose the negative phase of PDO, the odds are not so great that we're going to have a dryness issue. We'll have some below average precipitation, but a full-blown droughty environment is less likely to occur if we don't have either of those two phenomena playing out. So that's one of the things we have to watch closely. This is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index going back to 1900. And all I really want you to note here is that the red bars are the negative phase of PDO and the blue is the positive phase. We are currently in the negative phase, and it's important for you to note how significantly negative it was in the fourth quarter of 2021. It was as negative back then as it was back in the 1950s. That's important because that was a significant period of time, like today, where we had a persistent La Nina event, strongly negative PDO, and it was also occurring simultaneously after the 22-year solar cycle minimum, which occurred in 2020. This is an important parallel because every time we've been in this situation, we've had drought in at least a part of the middle of the United States, and even to a certain degree, North America in general. So what exactly does PDO do? Well, in the left-hand side of the chart, we're really only interested in the negative phase of PDO here. And I want you to notice a couple of things. First of all, the black line is the average jet stream position when we have a strong negative PDO during the growing season. Now, not during the winter. In this particular winter, we had a La Nina that was playing out, so the two patterns were fighting each other. But as we go into spring and summer, La Nina has less influence on the upper air wind flow, and PDO will have a much stronger influence if it stays significantly negative. So PDO produces a trough of low pressure along the west coast or over the western United States. Kind of depends on the intensity of the event and some other weather patterns that are occurring. But if you get a trough of low pressure over the western United States during our spring and summer, it's going to help to develop a ridge of high pressure over the plains, over the central part of the U.S. Strongly negative PDO events can push that trough pretty far inland up against the Rocky Mountains and then some, and can shift that high pressure ridge all the way into the western Corn Belt sometimes. Now, the other thing to note on this chart is the colors. The red and yellows are below normal precipitation. So when we have the negative phase of PDO, those areas that are yellow and red have a persistence of below normal precipitation that occurs. That should strike at least a little bit of familiarity because we just talked about the La Nina event that is also producing below normal precipitation, or usually does, in the central and southwest parts of the plains, central and southern plains. So we have both of these issues, the negative PDO and the La Nina, both supporting below normal precipitation in the plains, and the PDO helping to promote a ridge over that area. Now, if you put a ridge of high pressure over an area that's wet, the ridge won't hold together very well. But a ridge of high pressure absolutely loves to be over a dry region, because as that ridge gets over the region, it heats up the ground. If there's a lot of moisture in the ground, it'll warm the ground and bring the moisture out of the ground through evaporation, bring that warm, moist air up underneath the ridge and cause instability. Showers and thunderstorms pop up, and that can't happen when you got a ridge. The ridge has to break down. So if you put the ridge over a dry region like we have right now in the plains, then you're not likely to see that ridge weaken a whole lot. So again, the negative PDO and the La Nina and the drought that are already in place are going to work together. And as long as we keep that PDO and that La Nina in place, the odds are really good that we're going to see dryness. This is a statistical correlation that I performed based on a strongly negative PDO that occurs during the fourth quarter of the preceding summer season. So this would be October, November, and December of last fall. The PDO was substantially negative. In fact, there was only 3 times that the negative PDO was as intense as it was in those 3 months. And I did a correlation of what happens in the spring seasons after that takes place. And that's what you're looking at. The chart on the left is the Palmer Drought Index, and it shows the drought tends to be in place in June through August in the following summer, when we have a strongly negative PDO in the autumn fourth quarter. The chart on the right is precipitation for the same period of time, June through August, And it shows the most significant anomaly for below normal precipitation to be in the eastern Midwest. That's really important because what's taking place here, we already have dryness in the plains, right? And as long as we keep the PDO negative and La Nina in place, we're going to continue to keep that dryness in place. So this negative, or this correlation with the negative PDO and the drought in the central U.S. suggests that we're going to have dryness through much of the growing season. Now, we're going to have a chance for some rain here in the spring for a brief period of time, but we're not going to erase the moisture deficits. And as soon as we get into the warmer season in May and June, the evaporation rates will start outstripping the rain, and we'll end up with a more significant dryness issue. In the meantime, remember, La Nina produces wet bias conditions in the lower and eastern parts of the Midwest. So we may have some planting delays to get started with in the spring across parts of the Ohio River Basin, maybe reaching all the way over into Pennsylvania and down into the Tennessee River Basin and parts of the northern Delta. Those areas may get a slow start because it's too wet. This chart you're looking at on the right side of the screen suggests that there will be a higher than usual potential for the eastern Midwest to turn drier than normal when we get into June, July, and August. That should at least sound somewhat familiar, because if we are a little bit too wet in the spring and go dry in the summer, that's a little bit reflective of years like 1983. Not that I'm suggesting we're going to be at that level of extremity, but at the same time, the idea here is the drought will be present in the western Corn Belt, and there's potential that the dryness will expand into the eastern Midwest during the summer season. In the meantime, we also have to talk about the southeastern U.S. All right, I'm spending too much time on all this, so let me quickly throw in the solar cycle and some statistics, and we'll get to the bottom line here. The solar cycle obviously is based on sunspot numbers as observed through a telescope. From one minimum period of sunspot cycles to the next minimum, you're talking about 10 to 12 years, or 11-year cycle as we call it. The 22-year solar cycle is just two of these 11-year cycles put back to back. The difference, though, is in the second 11-year period, the polarity of the sun changes so that the North Pole becomes the South Pole and the South Pole becomes the North Pole. And when I do statistical analysis, I want to make sure that I've got apples to apples and oranges to oranges and not try to mess up anything. So I'm only interested in the 22-year cycle. I don't want to get into the wrong magnetic field phase of the sun for the other years. So when I take a look at that, one of the things that I notice, first of all, is that in the solar minimum, between the solar minimum and the solar maximum, about a 5.5-year period, there's a tendency for La Nina events to occur more often during that time period than at any other time in nature. You can find La Nina events that occur at other times, but they never last very long. Well, this is a statistical assessment here. This is the Oceanic Nino Index. You've seen this before. The Climate Prediction Center presents it. The blue numbers in the table are La Nina events. The red ones are El Nino. I have put circles around the 22-year solar cycle that we're in currently. So the 22-year solar cycle that we're in right now started in 2019, and the minimum occurred actually 2020. But other years that are part of this same cycle is 1954, 1976, and 1996. And what I want you to do is notice how many months of La Nina are associated with each of those solar minimums. So in 1954, there was a total of 29 months of La Nina that occurred after that solar minimum took place. In 1976, there was 36 months of La Nina. In the 1996 22-year solar cycle, there was 32 months of La Nina. In the far lower right-hand corner, we are just ended our 19th month, and we'll be starting our 20th month now. So we're not even in the same class yet of these other years. And that's why I think that the La Nina forecast that NOAA's model has some merit to it. And there is potential that we got a ways to go with La Nina. Very important. While this is up on the screen, look at the other solar minimum years, 1964, 1986, and 2008. And notice that there's usually a lot less months of La Nina that occur in those solar cycles. They rarely last nearly as long as what they are. The exception was in 2008 to 2010 to 2012. There was 23 months of La Nina that occurred. And guess what happened in the summer of 2012? Yeah, we had that drought in the U.S. These are members of the 22-year solar cycle. The top chart is the close to the solar minimum in each one of these years, or each one of these cycles. And I want you just to kind of glance from top to bottom through those years and notice how much dryness is around in the U.S. There's a tendency to when we're in this part of the 22-year solar cycle, there's a tendency for La Niña and PDO to persist, especially La Niña. And there's a tendency for drought to occur over multiple years. Not always in the same part of the country, but there's always drought around. It becomes even more impressive when you look at the old charts from 1950s and 1930s. Before you get too far ahead of me, in 1930s, we did not have a negative PDO. We had a positive negative PDO, but it was a significantly dry biased pattern, and there was a definite extended period of La Nina that was prevailing, and it was part of the same 22-year solar cycle. And the 1912 drought, 1910 through 1914 period of dryness also fits in really well. I'm just going to zoom through a couple of these charts real quickly. This is just comparing the drought year of 2002 to 2004 versus our drought last year. This is October of 03 compared to October of 21. Just notice the similarities in the drought. Who's wet and who's dry? Very similar situation. When we moved into January of 2004, we still have the same basic setup on the who's drought and who's wet. So the dryness didn't change much. But notice in January of 2022, there was a bit of a change that took place. We did get more dryness to occur in the Western Corn Belt and part of the plains. Seeing drought expand in the middle of winter is never a good omen. And we need to watch that closely over these next 6 weeks. This is the opportunity for this region to get some meaningful rain. If they don't get it, I'm afraid that we're probably moving down the road of a very dry year. Just so you know, in 2004, that drought that was in place in January changed very little through the month of March. And it did start to change, though, when we went into April. And as far as comparing these years of the 22-year solar cycle and the La Nina and the negative PDO, the upper left-hand chart is what tends to occur in October through March. And the two charts on the right-hand side are what has occurred this year. Now, real quickly, the reason why the upper right chart doesn't match real well, this is October through January, was a lot wetter in the northern plains. The reason for that is because La Nina in October was a very minor event, and instead the PDO was so significantly negative that it produced a big trough of low pressure off the Pacific Northwest coast and sent storm after storm into the northern plains. And that is the reason why it got wetter than usual. So I took October off and just looked at November through January, and you see there's a similarity in these years. Unfortunately, the February data wasn't available when I prepared this presentation, but I guarantee you it's going to look very similar. This is the summer seasons that follow those years that match this extended period of La Nina and the negative PDO. So what you're looking at is the upper air wind flow pattern that should occur in this coming summer. There should be a ridge of high pressure over the Rocky Mountain region, maybe the High Plains area, just looking at the average of all these other years in the past. And the signature for precipitation, given this setup, is that there would be below normal precipitation in the central and southern plains, part of the Western Corn Belt, part of the Delta and southeastern states. That's just what's happened in the past, not necessarily a forecast. But remember, the southeastern U.S. is supposed to dry out because of La Nina over these next few weeks. And then you're going to stick that negative PDO in place. You're going to build a ridge of high pressure over the middle of the country. That's going to create a northwest flow across the eastern part of the country. And precipitation coming into the southeastern states may not be all that great because it's a northwest flow instead of bringing moisture in from the tropics. So we may keep that dry bias, and we may see this chart verify relatively well. Temperatures should be warmer than normal in the middle of the country if we indeed see this pattern repeat. Again, this is all from 1956, 1975, and 2000 similarities. And just so you know, these are Palmer Drought Index, the upper left-hand chart here is the Palmer Drought Index for June through August of 56, 75, and 2000. And you can see where the dry bias is and how it is somewhat closely related to where we're kind of headed right now. The rest of these charts are precipitation anomalies for September in the upper right. October in the lower left and November in the lower right. And you can see that at least through September, this pattern may not break down very well. So we're probably going to go through a big part of the summer season with a lot of dryness around. All right, this is the upper air wind flow pattern real quickly. I'm going to see that how things change and why we don't necessarily get a good opportunity for precipitation to develop. In March, the pattern should be very similar to February. So we're going to have a split jet stream. We're going to have a ridge over western Canada, a northwest flow prevailing, little systems coming down the front side of the jet stream into the Midwest, producing some precipitation periodically. The southwest prairies in Canada will not see a lot of precipitation. And we'll also see the southern branch of the jet stream produce some showers over the Rocky Mountain region, but they will only partially get into the plains. The hard gray winter wheat country will only get a little bit of moisture, and it'll be during March and early April, and that's going to be about it. Because when we get into April, we start building a ridge of high pressure across a part of the central U.S. You can see it there on the chart here. And so as that ridge builds up, it's going to shut down the precipitation in hard gray winter wheat country in the western corn belt eventually. So this evolution brings, again, more precipitation into the Midwest, but the ridge axis has shifted in April, so it's more over the Canada prairies. So the Canada prairies will take a little break from precipitation briefly. We'll start bringing a little trough into the California coast and send a few showers off into the northwest plains, but with all the dryness there, those systems will probably fall apart a lot. When we get into May, the PDO will start kicking in a more significant manner. We'll see that trough of low pressure in the west. We'll start seeing precipitation occurring more frequently in that trough and moving up into Canada. If you're interested in Canada's prairies and the multi-year drought that's prevailing there, this is the beginning of the end of that drought. We will see precipitation occur in Canada off and on this spring, but when we get into the May, June, and July period, we're going to see a lot of precipitation coming up from that trough of low pressure that's going to be quasi-stationary off the west coast of North America, and we'll see a lot of moisture getting up into the prairies. The northern plains will also get involved with that to a certain degree, but it's going to depend on how strong the ridge of high pressure is in the middle of North America. And that'll be determined by the intensity of the PDO and also how much relief we get from the drought before we get into the warm season. So if we keep the dryness around and PDO stays strongly negative, the ridge in the middle of the U.S. is going to be strong. It'll throw probably a lot of dry air into the northern plains, eventually maybe even into Manitoba and southeastern Saskatchewan, and maybe dry them out. But they will end up have plenty of moisture in the spring and turn drier later. Same thing for the northern plains. They'll have plenty of moisture initially, at least the northeastern plains and upper Midwest, and then they may turn drier biased a little bit later down the road. For the month of March, we basically expect the anomalies to be very similar to those of February. So wet bias conditions in the lower and eastern parts of the Midwest, the Delta and the Tennessee River Basin area. We'll see a little bit of precipitation in eastern North Dakota, Minnesota, and northern Wisconsin. And the plains will probably keep a little bit of a drier bias. But notice I don't have solid below normal precipitation in hard gray winter wheat country. I think there's going to be a couple of systems that will come through that will produce a little bit of moisture in March, maybe early April too, that might actually help to green up the crop, maybe help to stimulate a little root repair, and perhaps maybe even a little bit of new tillering possibly. But as soon as we get into April and that ridge of high pressure starts to move into the middle of the country, it's going to shut down that precipitation pattern and also bring the temperatures up higher. So that we'll take a big step backwards. So as we take a look at the spring outlook in general, the charts on the left-hand side, we do kind of perpetuate that trend, but we should start seeing more and more drying and warmer weather occurring in the middle of the country as we go from April into May. By the time we get into summer, we should have quite a bit of dryness around in a big part of the western corn belt and plains in particular, high confidence in those areas, so the central and southern plains in particular. And I think we'll have some dryness. It'll be in the southeastern states as well. For the northern plains, the dry bias there is going to be totally determined by the intensity of the ridge, the amplitude and the positioning of it. I would say right now, if I had to put money on the table, I'd tell you that there will be a dryness trend that will occur in mid to late summer across the eastern Dakotas and Minnesota as the ridge becomes fairly significant. But the spring will be really quite favorable in that northern plains region and in Canada's prairies. Just a couple of quick other comments. Russia also has a tendency to be impacted by the 22-year solar cycle and persistent La Nina events. And if you go back in the history books, you'll find that quite often Russia also has a problem with drought during those periods. What tends to occur is in Russia, the dryness tends to be a one-year event instead of a two-year event, but there have been exceptions to that. In the 1970s, Russia had multiple years of dryness problems. Last year, one of the reasons why spring wheat prices went crazy was because we had drought in Canada, we had drought in the northern U.S. plains, and then over in Russia's southern newlands and parts of northern Kazakhstan, there was also a drought there. All these are important spring wheat areas. Some seeds produced in these areas as well. There's still lingering dryness in parts of northern Kazakhstan and parts of southern Russia's newlands. This is not necessarily seen at the topsoil moisture or even the subsoil moisture levels very well. You can see that there's some relief occurring there. But if we take a look at NASA's groundwater drought estimator, you can see that there is still a lot of dryness down deep in the ground. And that's a little bit worrisome, because if we start to build a ridge of high pressure in this area, that dryness will come back out and we'll end up evaporating that topsoil moisture fairly quickly and we're right back into another dry year. So that needs to be closely monitored. A little farther to the west, parts of Russia's Volga Basin and even a part of northeastern Ukraine have had multiple years of dryness too, and their groundwater situation is not a whole lot better. But the difference is those areas have seen a lot of precipitation this winter and last fall, and I think that there's going to be a better opportunity for them to come into spring without running a big risk of dryness. This last, well, it's not quite the last chart, but almost here, I just wanted to also tell you that there's a slight potential that northeast China could also have a little bit of a dry flavor here in their summer season. The northeast provinces of China produce soybeans, corn. About half of those crops come out of the three old Manchurian provinces. And some of the data, and what you're looking at is charts where I've combined the 18-year cycle and the 22-year solar cycle with La Nina, multiple year event taking place. And there's a tendency for the upper air flow pattern to be unfavorable for a lot of good rainfall. This is highly speculative. I don't have nearly the confidence for these areas in Asia as I do in North America, but we still need to watch them very closely as we get into the warm season. And lastly, down South America, everyone knows how dry it's been. The situation there has begun to ease up quite a bit. We've just received some substantial rains in Argentina, which has really pulled us away from the dry bias that we were enduring. We are, I think, in my opinion, we're done with the most stressful conditions in Argentina. The thing that will take place there over the next few months is it will have, next few weeks, is we'll have a persistence of below normal precipitation up in the far north, mostly cotton country, minor grain and oilseeds there, but most of the central and southern parts of Argentina, all the way down into southern Buenos Aires, will probably see a more routine occurrence of precipitation, and we'll probably see those temperatures a little bit milder. In Brazil, the same thing can be said. We're already whittling away at the dry bias in the southwest part of the country. Rio Grande do Sul will get some more rain here pretty soon. We're also going to see waves of light precipitation. The drier bias that's been in Paraguay will shift a little farther to the north, so we'll see it more into Bolivia and maybe a small part of northwestern Mato Grosso do Sul and northern Paraguay. But I think we're about done with the most persistent below normal precipitation in southwestern portions of Brazil, including Rio Grande do Sul. So as we take a quick look at their outlook for the safrinha crops, I think Brazil will do fairly well. The yellow hatching is near the above average precipitation for March and for April. We're still going to keep a little bit of a below normal bias near Paraguay during March, but that should be about the end of it. Again, we're just not going to see the same level of extremes that we've had in the past. And outside of that, I think that you get the idea here. My biggest concern is about the U.S. I think statistically we are in a very unique position to endure an expansion of dryness. The only way I see us busting on this forecast is for us to lose the PDO and lose La Nina. And right now, everything that I'm looking at is not suggesting that that will occur. So I'll turn it back over to Steve. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thanks, Drew. And just a reminder, every day I put out 3 grain comments a day. We do a morning conference call. We also do an overnight comments in which weather is included. And so as we get closer to the planting season, we'll focus a lot more on the weather. Also, if you have any questions, please send it to my email, steve.fried@admis.com, and we'll try to get you back a quick answer. So, Drew, thanks a lot for the information, and hope everybody has a good year. And remember, always treat people like yourself would like to be treated.